Hello, Blake Rudis here of Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and today I'm going to be putting the Canon 60 up against the Sony a6000 mirrorless camera. So you might think that this isn't a very fair fight. You get this DSLR versus this little mirrorless camera. How is that going to be fair? Well, my buddy Michael Cross has been looking for this Sony a6000 for quite some time, and he's been sending me some videos on YouTube. And what I've seen on YouTube is that this a6000 is destroying 5D Mark IIIs and Canon 60s. Now, I had to run several of my own tests to see if this was actually true. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at things like how both of these handle ISO, how they handle HDR images, what the RAW files look like that come straight out of these two cameras. And we'll also put them up against each other on a long exposure with something like the Lee Big Stopper on both of them. So before we get into that, let's actually look at the specs on both of these cameras, and then we'll dive into the pictures that we'll see from each of these as we put them together in this little camera grudge match. So before we get into the actual pictures and look at how these two compare, let's look at the spec sheets on both of them. The Canon 6D was developed in September of 2012. It is a full frame DSLR camera, meaning there is a mirror inside the camera that flips up and locks into place before the picture is taken, and after the picture is taken, that mirror flips back down. The price on something like this is about $17.99 approximately. It depends on where you get it, and that's for the body only without a lens. The megapixel count is about 20.2 megapixels. It shoots 4.5 frames per second, and it has a fixed display. It only has 11 points of autofocus. So you can see the Canon 60 is pretty much a landscape photographer's dream camera for its price, and you don't really need a whole lot of autofocus points as a landscape photographer, because typically, like myself, I'm in live view focusing. The Sony a6000 was developed in March of 2014, so just about last year. It's an APS-C sensor. It is an ILC or mirrorless camera, meaning when you take that lens off, the only thing you see back there is the sensor. There is no mirror in between that flips up. That reflex action in the mirror is not there. The price, only about $548 for this camera body, so that's really cheap for how powerful this little guy is. It's a 24 megapixel sensor. It shoots 11 frames per second, has a tilting LCD display, which is great if you're a landscape photographer on your tripod, and it has 179 focus points. So what are the differences between these cameras based on their spec sheets? Well, there's about 2 years difference in age. The Canon 60 is slightly older. It is a DSLR versus the ILC. On that note, the Canon is also a full frame camera versus an APS-C camera. So you're going to have a crop factor there. The full frame is not going to have a crop factor, meaning a 17mm lens is a 17mm lens. However, with the APS-C, you've got about a 1.5x crop factor, meaning it's going to multiply 17mm by a 1.5 to be about a 24-25mm equivalent with a 17mm lens. It's about $1,251 difference. The Canon is a lot more expensive than this little Sony. The Sony has 4 more megapixels. It has a tilting LCD compared to a fixed LCD and 168 more points of autofocus. So the Sony really isn't your landscape photographer's type of camera. It's actually very well made for action photography. All of the tests conducted were from a landscape photographer's perspective. That's really important to understand here before we get into the pictures. So what were the elements that I controlled during the experiment? Well, they were both mounted on the exact same tripod. I used a shutter release for both of them with live view focusing, so I manually focused both of the lenses myself. The lenses were all the same. If you can see on the image on the right of the Sony, it has a lens adapter attached to it, meaning I can use all of my Canon glass on the Sony camera. What this did, this allowed me to see just how great both of these cameras are with the exact same lenses. That way, there was no disparity between a Canon lens and a Sony lens. I was strictly looking at the sensors and how those sensors captured pictures through the exact same pieces of glass. Okay. The camera settings were all the same. If I used aperture of f4 on the Canon, I used an aperture of f4 on the Sony. If I used an ISO of 100 on the Canon, I used an ISO of 100 on the Sony. There was no lying here. I do not prescribe to a brand. I don't care. Focal length, okay, the focal length always remained the same. If I was 17 millimeters with the Canon, I was 17 millimeters with the Sony, and I did this to show the difference in crop factor and what crop factor can do to your images. Again, all tests conducted from a landscape photographer's perspective. It's really important to understand that, because to me, autofocus points don't matter. How fast a camera autofocuses doesn't really matter to me, because typically I'm live view focusing about 99% of the time on a tripod shooting landscapes. So before we actually get into the pictures in Photoshop, let's take a look at some of the features of these cameras that I noticed while I was on the scene.
One thing that must be discussed if you're going to be comparing the Canon 6D with the a6000 are the menu options. Now here in the Canon 6D, it's very easy. When you press this Q button, you've got your quick access to all of your different settings right at your fingertips, and the movement of a wheel, and you can change it very easily. Now this wheel is designated to only move as you move, like the exposure compensation here. If we push down on this wheel, it's not going to move anything else but the wheel left and right. It's very different than what you're going to see on the a6000. One of the main drawbacks to a compact camera like the a6000 is that a lot of the buttons are kind of combined to save space on the camera, which is great because it saves space on the camera. But let's say we're in something like manual mode and I need to change the shutter speed. If I'm moving this wheel and I accidentally press down, it's going to be wanting to switch to one of these settings on the wheel when you press down on that wheel. So now I need to kind of go back, and let's say I accidentally, as I'm moving around, hit the ISO button. Now I'm in the ISO settings and I'm changing my ISO, and all I wanted to do was change my shutter speed. Now the a6000 does have a quick menu when you press the function button, and this is something that you may have to set in the features so that you can access each one of these different areas individually, like you saw on the Canon 6D. However, the function on this wheel, that when you press down in any one of these areas, it's a directional arrow combined with a wheel, which can be very frustrating when you're trying to change your shutter speed and you accidentally change your ISO. I can't tell you how many times during my tests that this happened on this camera. Again, it's a drawback to having a compact camera because they're trying to combine multiple things into one little teeny tiny camera body. The Sony a6000 can shoot 10 frames per second, which makes it an absolute beast for HDR. Just listen to this. Look at how fast that thing records images for HDR. So what does that mean for HDR? Well, that means that if there's any motion in the scene, it's going to be very limited because it's capturing those exposures extremely fast. What that also means is that it's actually a lot easier to hand hold your HDR images with the Sony a6000. Let's hear that again. The Canon 6D can only shoot about 4.5 frames per second, so this is what it sounds like for HDR. Again, so it's a much slower than the a6000.
Now, the crop factor plays a really important role between these two cameras. And the reason being because a full frame camera does not have what you call a crop factor because it's a 35mm equivalent. So a 17mm lens is a 17mm lens. A 300mm lens is a 300mm lens. But then when you get into the APS-C or crop sensor cameras, you have what's called a crop factor. So the APS-C crop factor is actually 1.5 times. So whatever lens you put on there, it's going to multiply the focal length by 1.5. So 17 millimeters becomes something like 24 or 25 millimeters, but 300 millimeters becomes 450 millimeters. So here's the Canon 6D with a 70-300 lens on. At 300 millimeters, I'm zoomed in as far as I can go to this lock that's on a gate. Okay. Now, here is the difference between the Sony a6000. This is at 300 millimeters, zoomed into that exact same lock. Notice the difference, how much closer that gets you with that 300 millimeter lens. It's actually really quite nice. But then there's the other side. There's the wide angle side. So while it's nice to get more focal length out of your zoom lenses, you're going to get less focal length out of your wide angle lenses. So if you have a 17mm lens like you see here with the Canon 6D, on the Sony a6000, it's going to be cropped in, multiplying that, making it about 24 to 25 millimeters with that 17mm crop factor times 1.5. With the Canon 6D, look right here at these lights. Look at how much more you have visible in this image compared to the Sony a6000 in this image. So you can see that plays a huge role in your wide angle lenses. It's really going to cut down on your wide angle lenses. If you wanted the same equivalent of 17 millimeters on a full frame camera, you'd need something like 10 or 11 millimeters on a crop sensor camera. So let's take a look at ISO. So here's the Sony a6000 and here is the Canon 6D, both at an ISO of 3200. So I'm just going to grab this a6000 picture and bring it right on top of the Canon picture, and I'm going to line up the background right there, back there, right on top of each other. And in order to do that, I'm going to change this to difference. What that's going to do is it's going to allow me to line the back portion of this right up with each other. Now, I know that things are a little bit bigger in the Sony a6000 version because of the crop factor. However, when we zoom in all the way back there, we can see the differences between the ISO with the Sony a6000 and with the Canon 6D. The ISO setting here at 3200 seems to be a little bit softer on the Canon side. Here's the Canon picture that we're looking at now, and here's the a6000. Notice how everything's a lot sharper, and that sharpness is going to affect the detail in our image. So if we were to do some noise reduction, that sharpness would still kind of stay on the areas of high ISO and kind of give us that crunchy film grain type of look. There's also a lot more color noise in the darker areas in the Sony a6000. You see that there's some green color noise in the areas of black, whereas the Canon 6D has kind of rendered that black area much better. At ISO 3200 in broad daylight, there's really no sense to be at ISO 3200. However, this is just an example to show you the differences between something like the Canon 6D at ISO 3200 and the Sony a6000 at ISO 3200. If you can see here, the water here on the lower portion of the image is definitely a lot more noisy than in the Canon version. We could very easily fix that color noise and be moving well on our way without affecting the image too much. Whereas with the Sony, we might have some trouble with that. But even then, it's minimal. It's very minimal. Even at ISO 3200, this camera does hold its own. So let's take a look at long exposure. What I did was I put a 10-stop neutral density filter on each one of these cameras to see if maybe the sensor would handle a neutral density filter differently. And to my surprise, or I guess lack thereof, there really wasn't that much of a difference between the Sony a6000 with a long exposure and with the Canon 6D with a long exposure. You can see that this is the Sony a6000 version and this is the Canon 6D version. Both of them have pretty much the same amount of depth of field kind of happening here, even though they're both focused on the same area, and there is relatively the same amount of noise that would be in both of those longer exposures. So I really wasn't too surprised with that. With a filter on, they both operate relatively similar, if not the exact same. So now let's take a look at both of these for HDR. What you're seeing in front of you is the Canon 6D version of the HDR. What I did was I put a 14mm lens on both of them, shot 3 exposures, +2, -2, and 0. I brought both versions into Photomatix, processed them the exact same way, and did nothing else. I didn't run them through Camera Raw. I didn't do anything else to these exposures because I really wanted to see just kind of how they would look right out the door from Photomatix. So here's the here's the Sony a6000 version, pardon me. If we zoom in here, we can see that there's quite a bit of what looks like aberration kind of on the side of these pillars. Let's go ahead and zoom into the 6D version. And we still kind of have that same chromatic aberration. Anytime we're doing HDR, we're going to have a chromatic aberration party in those areas where chromatic aberration exists. Now let's look at something like the foliage here, or dead foliage, we should say. And it looks like there's a lot less aberration or problems happening in the Canon version than there are in the Sony a6000 version. However, there was a very, very, very slight breeze. Now, I did nothing when it came to the removing of ghosts. Look at these, look at the foliage here. Okay, there's barely any movement there. And then look at the foliage here. It's relatively soft. Now, you heard it. The Sony a6000 fires really fast. So if there is any movement, it's pretty much going to be null and void, maybe even not there. All right, now look at the Canon 6D version. See how it's kind of soft? A lot of that is probably from that very slight breeze without me doing any deghosting. All right, so there's a pretty big difference there between the foliage. So as far as for HDR, the Sony a6000 is definitely a faster shooter, and you're going to see probably a little bit better rendering when it comes to the tone mapping because of the fact that it can shoot 11 frames per second. There is not going to be any movement in there whatsoever, whereas we're actually seeing some movement in the softness of the Canon. Usually you can fix that with some sharpening, but it looks like the a6000 might actually win in that HDR department because it shoots so fast. So let's take a look at some of the reports from something like DP Review. Now, DP Review is a website that I use quite often when I'm looking at cameras and comparing specs and looking at reviews of cameras, because I think they do a really good job. And now, actually, if you go to Amazon, anything that's been reviewed by DP Review, you will usually see that review on Amazon. So these are actually screenshotted from Amazon, and I brought them right here into Photoshop to make it a little bit easier. What I did was I removed the connectivity option right here that was in this a6000 because it wasn't in the 6D. And the reason why is because I'm going to layer these right on top of each other so we can see spec for spec how these come through in something like the DP Review. Now, many of the things that I've discussed, they already discussed here in these reviews as to why you would want the Canon 6D over the a6000 in the areas of things to consider. One of those main points is that the Canon 6D does not have very many points for autofocusing. It's only got 11. It's got a very slow burst rate. We saw that with the HDR capabilities with the 6D and the a6000. But it's got excellent JPEG and RAW files. Now, you can read these on Amazon. There's no real need for me to read those to you. But what I do want to show you here is that I've layered these, and when I layered these, what I did was I changed the color of the Canon 6D to orange, so that when I overlay these on top of the a6000 and change this to hard light, we can actually see which one beats which one where. Okay, so the Canon 6D has a little bit better build quality, which is something we could expect when you have a $1,300 difference in price. Ergonomics and handling, I have to agree that the Canon 6D is a little bit better with ergonomics and handling because of the sturdy grip that they've got on the right-hand side of it. But when you have those small compact cameras like the a6000, it's not designed to be ergonomically friendly. It's more designed to fit in a very small bag. I may even be able to fit that without a lens in one of my pockets. It's that small. Features are about the same because spec for spec, they're almost identical when it comes to features. With metering and focusing accuracy, I definitely could agree with the a6000 being a little bit better than that. But then again, you've got that difference between $1,200 difference between cameras. It's something that you can expect to see. Now, when it comes to the raw quality, from what I saw in both images, I didn't see too much difference in the raw images. Now, I looked at both cameras very extensively with the exact same lenses on them, and the raw files were almost identical when it came to quality. Okay, so even though that shows it being a little bit higher here on this report, I would venture to say that they're probably very similar, if not the same, when it comes to raw quality in my experience. JPEG quality, I can't speak for that because I don't shoot in JPEG. Low light, high ISO performance, definitely the Canon 6D wins that one. We looked at that with the ISO. The viewfinder and screen rating, well, I would have to say that I like the Canon's viewfinder a lot better because it's not a digital viewfinder. The a6000 has a digital viewfinder. So when you look in there, you're seeing a digital depiction. The big difference there is when you're looking at DSLR, because it's got a mirror that reflects the image that you're seeing off of that mirror up into a prism and into your eye. So you're actually seeing a mirror reflection of what you're going to shoot. Whereas with the mirrorless cameras, they're showing you the sensor's depiction in a digital form through the viewfinder. So for me, I definitely have to say I like the viewfinder a lot better in a DSLR, and that's even worth that $1,200 price for me to have a better viewfinder because it's that important to me. Now the screen itself, I like the tilting action that they put in the Sony a6000. I like that viewfinder tilts, because as a landscape photographer who does a lot of live view focusing, if I'm at a very low angle, if I'm using my Canon 6D, I have to lay on the ground in order to see the focusing that I'm going to get on the image. Whereas with the a6000, I can just kneel down, tilt the screen towards me, and I'm there. I don't know why Canon doesn't put that in their higher end cameras. It really frustrates me. Performance-wise, it looks like the a6000 does beat the 6D in performance. I can't really speak for that. Video mode, I don't use the video capabilities in either of my cameras. However, I have read a lot of reviews that the Sony has a few issues if you're trying to record anything longer than 10 minutes. But again, I can't speak on video. Value, there it is. They're both right on the same line together. If you're going into buying the Sony a6000 because you want a smaller camera and you don't want to lug around a Canon 6D, it's the perfect value. But then again, on the Canon 6D side, if you want all the bells and whistles of a high-end full-frame camera, but don't want to pay the price of a full-frame camera, the value meets there too. So these cameras, spec for spec, even report for report, are relatively identical.
All right, so there you have it. You've seen both now. So what's my final report? Well, this is a great little camera. It's a beast. It can hold its own against many of the DSLRs that we have out these days. However, it doesn't quite fit what I need for HDR. My primary weapon of choice is still going to be my Canon 6D. I love this camera. However, the a6000 puts up a really good fight. There are only two real gripes that I have with this camera that set it apart. As far as image quality is concerned, they're almost exact replicas, even at something like ISO 3200. However, I do not like the menu system on this. Every time I turn that dial wheel, I end up changing the ISO when all I wanted to do was change the shutter speed. On the other side of that, I really don't like the crop factor. That 1.5 crop factor really kind of hurts me because I am a wide angle landscape photographer. For me, I love to get the most out of my 14 and 17 millimeter lenses, so I'm definitely going to stick with my Canon 6D. That doesn't mean that this isn't a good camera though, okay? It definitely puts up a fight. Now, I don't own a 5D Mark III, so I can't put it up against that, but against the Canon 6D, this little guy puts up more of a fight than I ever would have imagined. Now, price difference, there's a huge price disparity between these two, so at $1,000 less for something like this, that's pretty good value. So Sony's really doing something in this market to put the hurting on these current DSLRs that we have out. How long before I make my switch to a full mirrorless? I have no idea, but you know what? I look like I might be going in that direction. So what do you think? Are you going to switch over to this mirrorless thing, drop your DSLR, get yourself a Sony a6000? Or, there's plenty of other mirrorless cameras on the market, but I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are. What direction do you think we're going with photography? Do you think that these mirrorless cameras are something that's actually going to be the next gold standard and that our DSLRs are going to slowly fade out? I'm curious because, you know what, I'm thinking about making that switch, and it may just be a matter of time before the technology actually keeps up and catches up to some of these DSLRs that we can start dropping some of the weight that we have laying around. Again, I'm Blake Rudis with Everyday HDR and HDR Insider. If you like this, please subscribe, and you can go ahead and keep all of this conversation alive in the comments section below. Thank you for stopping by.